Zoom. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 18th Sadli Lecture. This year's theme of Sadli Lecture explores broken ladders, labor market inequality in Indonesia and India. First of all, allow me to introduce myself. I am Devina Ndita, and I'm honored to be your host for this event. Before we begin today's event, let us all together listen to the Indonesian national anthem, Indonesia Raya. We kindly ask our participants to stand up. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be seated. Now, we would like to invite Bapak Firman Witular Kartadiputra, Associate Professor of Crawford School of Public Policy, ANU College of Asia and the Pacific, to deliver his opening remarks. Bapak Firman, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our online audiences in Australia and around the world. My name is Firman Ditular, and I'm from ANU Indonesia project. On behalf of the organizers, the Institute for Economic and Social Research, LPM, FABUI, and ANU Indonesia project, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the 18th Sadli lecture. Uh, for the past 17 years, the ANU Indonesia project have been blessed with the opportunity to work together with LPM, FABUE to organize this lecture series. We are really grateful for this long-standing collaboration. Um, I would like I would also like to express our thanks to the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, and to Bank Mandiri and UN University Wider for their support of this year's lecture. The Sadli lecture is named in honor of the late Professor Muhammad Sadli for his enormous role in the public debate on the Indonesian economy for more than half decade. Through his role as an academic, Professor Sadli was a director of LPM and a professor of FAUE, a cabinet minister, a leading public intellectual. Professor Sadli helped us not only in Indonesia, but also in Australia and the rest of the world to understand the economic policy challenges faced by Indonesia and what the policy choices were available. As a prolific commentator on economic affairs, Professor Sadli demonstrated the importance of an independent voice in policy debate and policy making processes. Pak Sadli was a teacher, a mentor, a colleague, a friend to many Indonesian economists. Some of them are here. And in the words of Hal Hill and the late Tae Kian Lee, a cosmopolitan intellectual, a wise guru, and a generous friend. It is to recognize his contribution in shaping the public debate on Indonesian economy that the Sadli Lecture was organized. Since its inception in 2007, the goal of the Sadli Lecture has always been to take a comparative approach to broaden the understanding and to stimulate discussion about key economic policy changes faced by Indonesia. Starting last year, we also expanded the Sadli lecture series to have a special focus on gender issues in every other year to recognize Professor Saparina Sadli's pioneering contribution in women's studies and her work in human rights and social justice. Today, we meet here to listen and discuss what I know will be an excellent lecture from Professor Kunal Sen from UN University Wider about the nature of informality and the path to job mobility in Indonesia and India. In the lecture, Professor Sen will offer insight based on his rigorous examinations of the labor market landscape in the two countries. As in previous years, the study lecture is based on a commission paper to be published in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies. And at this point, I would like to thank the Associate Professor Chris Manning from ANU, Dr. Dino Leonardo Meroto from the World Bank, and our anonymous colleagues for their detailed and thorough comments on the first draft of the paper. I fully expect that Professor Sen will again receive useful feedback from our distinguished discussant, Dr. Monica Wiharja and Dr. Dewa Wisana, as well as from the audience. Looking forward to seeing the paper in August. Yes. Finally, before we move on to the main events, I would like to inform everyone that the ANU Indonesia project is now hard at work in preparing the ANU Indonesia Update 2024, which will be convened by Dr. E. Warburton and Dr. Sana Jeffrey. The title of the update is How Jokowi Changed Indonesia, and it will be held on September 13 and 14 this year. So please clear your calendar for the very exciting conference. This concludes my opening remarks. Again, I would like to thank everyone for coming.
Okay, thank you, Bapak Firman, for your remarks and introduction to Professor Sadli and also the Sadli Lecture Series. Now, to formally open the 18th Sadli Lecture, we would like to invite Dean of Faculty of Economics and Business, Bapak Teguh Dartanto, to deliver his keynote remarks. Without further ado, Bapak Teguh, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Very good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Thank you very much for Associate Professor, Crawford School of Public Policy, ANU, College of Asia and the Pacific, Bapak Firman Witular, for giving opening. And the speaker of the 18th study lecture, Professor Kunal Sen, discussion in study lecture, Ibu Maria Monica and Bapak Idewa Gede Karma Wisana, Director LTM, Bapak Jakal Nurjatin, Professor Mari Pangestu, for coming to Depok from Jakarta, and also Professor Arif Ansori coming from Bandung to here, maybe start in the morning with some sitting here. And also distinguished guests, college ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome the Sadli lecture. It is an honor and a privilege to stand before you today, representing the Faculty of Economic and Business, into discussion that the challenge our understanding and set our ambition toward a more equitable the global economy. As we gather today in this auditorium, I would like to remind the rich legacy of these lectures named after the renowned economist, Professor Sadli, who was a founder of the wisdom and a pioneer of, in the economic thought in Indonesia. Like him, we are committed to examining the crucial issues that affect our societies, issues like the labor market dynamics, inequality, economic development, and these themes today that are at the heart of the Professor Kumal Sen enlightening research. I think it's also not only Prof. Saldi, not only as a pioneer and also a pioneer in economic thought, but also our faculty also thanks to Professor Sadli for his endowments, Professor Chair to the FAPUI that every year Sadli Indo funds provide research fund for the young faculty member to research. Today, Professor Sen will share his findings from a detailed study titled Broken Ladders, Labor Market Inequality in India and Indonesia, which uses the framework to explore and analyze the nuance of the labor market in these two populous and rapidly evolving economies. This topic is also timely as our statistics office in Monday just released the report about the labor market condition in Indonesia. Yes, there are increasing job 3.55 million jobs, but the quality of the created job is not really good, as the 2.5 million job created is coming from informal sector and some of them are still under employment. So this job ladder framework as applied by Professor Sen is a tool that allows us to categorize employment into several tiers, ranging from the formal to informal sector and from upper to the lower tiers within the sector. This model is instrumental, is helping us understanding not just the quantity of job, but the quality of this job, which is crucial for understanding economic outcome and the individual well-being. I myself also doing research on the most likely economic mobility, but now is trying to study about the labor mobility, intergenerational labor mobility, comparing between parents and children between the in the agricultural sector. We would like to know, is there any movement from informal to formal sector? The Professor Sen's research present a stark portrayal of the labor market in both Indonesia and India. He finds that a larger proportion of the workforce in this country is categorized in the lower tier job. This position are often marked by instability, underpaid, limited benefit, which starkly contrasts with the fewer but highly formal job that offer better security and better benefit. This dichotomy creates what the Professor Sense refers to as the broken ladders, where the step between the lower and the upper tiers are not just steps, but sometimes missing, making socioeconomic mobility a significant challenges. So yeah, this is very interesting when I look at the Professor and the PPT. The ladder in the middle is like the broken, so the people will stay at the informality. It's very difficult to climb up in the job ladder. This is confounded by disparities that are influenced by gender and education, where women and less educated individuals find themselves disproportionately in the lower tier of jobs. These situations might not be unique to Indonesia and India, but this is also happened all around the world. Labor market are expected to experience the similar challenges in all over the world. Global economic shift, technological advancement, international trade dynamics have all played a role in reshaping the labor market. Understanding this pattern help us to contextualize the finding of the Professor Sen within a broader the global narrative of economic development and the labor transformation. Historically, we have seen economies evolve from the agrarian space to industrial base, and now is shift to the service-dominated job. But some of the transformation is jumping from the low productivity and agriculture sector to jump to the low productivity in the service sector. So its transitions broke with its shift in the labor market structure often mirroring what we currently witness in Indonesia and India. The historical context enrich our understanding and provide a lens through which we can interpret these modern challenges. The insights from the Professor Sen work are very valuable for policymaker, educator, and the business leader. They underscore the urgent need for policies that not only create the job, but improve the quality of the job itself. Education emerged as the key factor in this mobility. This is very critical role that our education institution in preparing a workforce that is resilient, adaptable, and capable to climb these ladders. Moreover, this recent invite us to rethink our approaches to economic development, urging move away from the short-term gain and toward long-term sustainable growth that is inclusive and equitable. This involves innovative policy framework that address the root causes of the labor market disparities and foster a more robust economic development. Let these lectures of us as call to action for all of us. As the academicians, students, policymakers, and practitioners, we are equipped to drive the change by engaging with the research presented today. We can begin to formulate strategies that tackle this disparities, ensuring that economic growth translate into improvement across all tiers of the job market. As we move forward with the today's lecture, I encourage you to engage deeply with the Professor Sen's finding, discuss, debate, and trying to derive insight that you can take back to your spheres of the influence. Together, we can pathway that lead to more just and the prosperous world. Thank you once again and your presence and your commitment to making a difference. Let us continue to be inspired by the legacy of the Professor Shan, and let us strive to emulate his dedication to understanding and improving the economic landscapes of our nation. Let the discussions begin, and I wish you all have the fruitful discussion. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi. Yeah, Bapak Teguh, thank you for sharing your excellent opening remarks to highlight the condition of underemployment and the quality of job in labor market as part of our topic for today. Before we proceed to our main session, we extend an invitation to all speakers, discussion, and chair, Bapak Teguh Datanto, Bapak Firman Witular, Profesor Kunalsen, Ibu Maria Monika Wiharja, Bapak Idewa Gede Karma Wisana, and Ibu Hairina Hanum Siragat to join us on stage for a brief photo session. Please. Yeah, in front of the stage here. Thank you to all speakers and discussants. You may now return to your seats. Since 2007, LPM FEB UI and the NU Indonesia Project have collaborated to present the annual Sadli Lecture Series. This initiative aims to deepen understanding and ignite discourse among students, academics, and policymakers regarding Indonesia's significant and pressing economic policy challenges. The lecture serves as a tribute to the late Professor Muhammad Sadli, a notable figure celebrated for his astute analysis of economic affairs in Indonesia throughout his lifetime. Starting from 2023, the Sadli Lecture also addresses topics of gender equality and social inclusion in honor of Professor Emeritus Saparina Sadli. This year's lecture will be delivered by Professor Kunal Sen, Director of the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki, Finland. The session is scheduled to run until 12 p.m. and to all attendees and distinguished guests, we extend our best wishes for a productive and enlightening lecture. Before we begin, we would like to express our sincere gratitude to Bank Mandiri, the sponsor of today's event, for their generous support and their commitment to innovation and community development has been instrumental in making this seminar possible. And we are profoundly thankful for their collaboration in facilitating today's knowledge exchange. Now, it is my honor to invite Ibu Khairina Hanum Siregar, Junior Research Associate of the Institute for Economic and Social Research, LPM FEB UI, to chair today's lecture. Ibu Hanum, the stage is yours.
Okay, good morning, Ibu and Bapak. Good afternoon or evening for anyone who's dialing from Zoom or YouTube. My name is Hanu, and I will be the moderator for this session for the next 2 hours. I'm very honored to be the moderator of today's lecture titled Broken Ladders, Labor Market Inequality in Indonesia and India, which will be presented by Professor Kunal Sen. Yang terhormat Bapak Firman Witula, Associate Professor of Crawford School of Public Policy ANU, Ibu Mai Pangestu, Ibu Saparina Sadli, who cannot join us today, Pak Teguh Datanto, Pak Chaikal Noyakin, the Director of LPM, and the distinguished discussion. Before we dive into our discussion about the labor market inequality in Indonesia and India, I would like to a little bit reflecting back about what LPM FEBUI has done about the informal workers, on the research about informal workers. Actually, we have conducted many research about informal workers, especially on the provision of the social protection, since it's such a tools to reduce the inequality between the informal workers, and also as mentioned by Pak Teguh, that it also will increase their well-being. So today we have Professor Kunal Sen, who will discuss about the labor market inequality in Indonesia and India, the two giants, Asian two giants. This paper examines the nature of labor inequality in both countries using the job ladder framework. This framework differentiates in detail between formal and informal job. And Professor Kunal Sen is the director of the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research since 2019. He is also a professor of development economics at the University of Manchester and ISA Institute of Labor Economics. He has performed extensive research on international finance, the political economy determinants of inclusive growth, the dynamics of poverty, social exclusion, female labor force participation, and the informal sector in developing countries. So I would like to ask Prof. Kunal Sen to come up on the stage. So please, Professor. And on this general lecture, we also have two distinguished discussions. The first is Ibu Maya Monica Wihaja. She is visiting fellow in Isyarat Institute Singapore. Currently, she also adjunct assistant professor in National University Singapore. She has worked mainly in food security and agricultural reforms agenda, jobs and digital economy. So I invite Ibu Maya Monica to come to this stage. And the second discussion is Pak I Dewa Gede Karmawisana. Currently, he is a head of Lembaga Demografi Universitas Indonesia. So I would like to invite Pak Dewa to join us in the stage. This session will be divided into 3 sessions. The first session is the presentation from Professor Kunal San. The time is about 40 minutes. And then the second session is the presentation from each discussions. Each session is 10 minutes for each discussion. And then Professor Kunal San will respond the discussions for 5 minutes. Then we will follow with the Q&A session. It will be 45 minutes. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Kunal Sen to deliver your lecture. Please, Professor, thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank the Dean, Faculty of Business in Indonesia for the kind opening remarks and your kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and also thank you to the Indonesia Project, also National University, and FEB Indonesia for the invitation to give the lecture. Let me actually begin with some personal memories of Professor Muhammad Sadli. And to do that, I have to go back 32 years in time. So at that time, I just came back from the US after my PhD, went back to India to work in a think tank in Bombay. India was going through some major economic reforms in 1991, and we felt that we had to learn from our Asian neighbors on how they went through the reform process. Of course, Indonesia was one of the most important countries for us to study, along with South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia. At that time, China was not half in that same category. So we thought, how do we actually then do a study tour of Indonesia? We know no one here. So we thought, okay, perhaps we write to Professor Muhammad Sadli. We had heard about his reputation. So we sent a letter. At that time, there was no emails. And we were really with a lot of trepidation because we thought these 4 unknown Indians in an institute in Bombay, nobody's heard of. How will he see this letter? Well, much to our surprise, he wrote back and said, come on, come to Jakarta. I'll be there for you. And we came here. We were here for about 2 weeks. And thanks to him, all the doors to senior policymakers opened up. Senior policymakers, academia, all opened up. And those 2 weeks, we learned so much about Indonesia. Also in the process, I remember those evenings and afternoons, we spent a lot of time talking about India and Indonesia. He would ask lots of questions about what's happening in India, the reforms, what can we learn from this, what's the future for India now? And I was struck by his innate curiosity about India. And so I thought, when I was invited to give this lecture, that as a mark of respect to him, I would do an India-Indonesia comparison. Obviously, with all the constraints of comparative work that we all are aware of. And so from that particular study tool, my first book was published, co-authored with colleagues in Bombay, led to many other books. But I always value his act of generosity to some unknown Indians at that time, very early in our careers, and the way he helped us. So moving on now to the lecture itself. So what I want to do in this lecture, as I said, basically this is a comparative project, a comparative paper. And of course, comparative projects have fallen out of favor because they're quite difficult to do. So I'm going to sort of start with the caveat that this is always going to be a challenge for all of us to do when compared to very large Asian countries. I'm not sure if you can see my slides at this point. Can you? Yes? Okay, I can't see myself, so I'll go to, oh, that's coming up. Okay, great. So the title of this lecture and the paper that will be published in the IES is Broken Ladders, Labor Market Inequality in Indonesia and India. And it takes a bit of time to move on. Has it moved on? Okay, great, okay. So inequality is a big concern now. It is part of the 2030 agenda. So what we see is that we see cross-country inequality reducing, so global inequality, probably because of growth in China and India and many other Asian countries in particular. But within country inequality has been increasing, not everywhere, but in many countries. And so obviously this particular SDG 10 in the 2030 agenda, which is about reducing inequality, has become a very big issue in the UN and elsewhere. Now, one major determinant of overall inequality is labor market inequality, or what we call earnings inequality. And of course, why is that a big issue? Because workers are paid very differently across different kinds of jobs. And we have workers in very poorly paid jobs and precarious conditions, while we have workers on relatively better paid jobs in better working conditions. The distinction particularly that's useful that people make is formal and informal workers. They have different remunerations, working conditions, and of course we know informal workers are often poorly paid as compared to formal workers. Now, both Indonesia and India have very large informal labor force. So Indonesia, the ILO estimates about 85%, India 88%, so not much difference in that sense. Both of them contribute together 20% of the world's global labor force. 1 out of every 5 workers in this world are either from Indonesia or India. They contribute 1/3 of Asia's labor force. 1 out of every third worker in Asia are either from Indonesia or India. So whatever happens in these two countries has a huge effect, not only in Asian labor market inequality, but globally also. And that's exactly why it's important to understand what's happening in these two very large Asian countries. So the point now, the early work had said, okay, informal, formal distinctions are important, but increasingly the concern is that if majority of your workers in the informal sector, how does it help to make a formal-informal distinction in itself, important as it is? And increasingly there has been interest among labor economists to understand that informality itself is very heterogeneous. And that distinction has been particularly happened in the last 10 years of labor economics research in developing countries. So, for example, in low and middle income countries, we often see informality a place for residual employment, those who can't find jobs in the formal sector, often from impoverished, marginalized, and vulnerable workers. But it also could be a place where workers start out, enterprises start out, and then move up to the formal sector. So it could also be the staging ground of household enterprises as they become entrepreneurs, and maybe at some point become formal as well. So we can have in informality 2 kinds, if you wish, of workers, enterprises. Some for subsistence, and some which are actually going to be accumulating capital as they go forward. And also keep that both in mind. So given that we are aware that there is this distinction in informality, how do we think about it? And this particular distinction comes from the work of Gary Fields, who's perhaps the leading labor economist on developing countries in terms of conceptual work. And the distinction he makes, which is what I'm going to use in my lecture, is that basically there are 2 kinds of informality, which is low-tier informality and upper-tier informality. The lower-tier informality is casual work, and if you're a wage-employed worker, or if you're self-employed, own account enterprises, household enterprises, 2 or 3 workers in a family running a small little enterprise, not particularly very productive. Upper-tier work are workers who are still informal. They don't have social protection. They don't have security of tenure, but they have some de facto benefits. They might get maternity benefits, they might get some kind of other benefits, annual leave, so there's some benefits that they might get as wage workers. Or they may be enterprises which are now grown enough, big enough to employ other workers. So they are now employers in the ILO classification as employers. So therefore, even in informality, there are lower tier informality, both in self-employment, household own account workers, or in wage employment, casual wage workers. So think of a self-employed, it's a street vendor, common self-employment we see in low-income countries. Wage workers are construction workers, wage workers working in construction sites are another usual example. So these are lower tier. Upper tier could be a plumber, electrician who's not yet formal, but is still working, self-employed. Or upper tier could be a worker in a formal enterprise who does not have security tenure or all the benefits that other workers in the same company might have. So this is the way you can think about upper tier and lower tier. Along with that, we have another distinction that's important, that is wage employment and self-employment. They are 2 very different kind of work because you get different remuneration, different working conditions, different determination of your earnings in whether you are wage employed or self-employed. So effectively, what we're looking at now are 6 kinds of work status. 2 are up in the formal, self-employed, wage employed. Then we have 4 in the informal, upper tier, upper tier, self-employed, upper tier, wage employed. And then we have lower tier self-employed and lower tier wage employed. So if you think about the labor market in a developing country, effectively you're looking at 6 different kinds of work status. So what I'm going to try and do, using this kind of scheme, and I'm going to try to make it clearer to you, I'm going to look at how labor market inequality, using these tiers of labor market analysis, how have this evolved over time using obviously representative data. So where are the workers placed in different tiers of the labor market in these two countries? How have earnings disparities evolved over these different kinds of work that workers do in labor markets in Indonesia and India? What differentiates Indonesia and India? And what unites them? Are there differences? And are there similarities? And what are they? And I'm also going to speak a little bit about what might be explaining why a particular worker might be in the lower tier, upper tier, or lower tier informal, upper tier informal, or in the formal sector. What explains that? So that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to first give you an exposition of the job ladder framework that I'm going to use very briefly. I'm going to very quickly review economic policies and economic development processes in these two countries, because you need to situate this whole thing that I'm going to do with the broader economic development processes that happened in these two countries over the last 20 odd years. And then we're going to, as I said, look at the application of the job ladder in Indonesia and India, and then look at earnings disparities, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what might explain why workers are placed in different parts of the labor market, and then I'm trying to cover different policy implications. That's the outline. So the conceptual framework that I'll use is called the job ladder framework, and I'm going to go through this a little bit systematically. Just to be clear, we're going to use Sackler's unit record data from 2001, 2010, 2020, in part 2001 to kind of avoid the post-crisis years. Just 2001, still we think that it's not as badly affected by the 1996 AFC, Asian financial crisis. 2010, some in middle, and 2020 is one more recent data we have. And then the other part is the unit record data from the Sackler, and so for India, we have the employment, unemployment surveys, and we have the periodic labor force surveys, which are very similar to Sackler's. It's a big representative labor force surveys done by the National Statistical Agency in India, so comparable in sampling and everything else, so quite comparable in many respects. And we're going to use 1988 because we have data going back in time, unit record data, 2000, 2012, and 2022. So we have 4 years there. And so it's sort of make the unfair as comparable as possible, but cannot be exactly. And now I had 1988 because it's a pre-reform year. 1991 in India was a reform, big reforms. So I thought we should be good to have 1 year which is before the reform started. So that's why 1988. Otherwise, more or less, the other years are very similar to the years that we have for Indonesia. Now, the book that we have, where you put this forward, this framework together first, is the book that came out last year, The Job Ladder, Transforming Informal Work and Livelihoods in Developing Countries. It's a book that was published by Oxford University Press. It's open access. You can download it freely. And it's, the editors are there. Gary Fields is the lead editor, Tim Gilling, myself, Michael Danquas, Simone Scott, and colleagues of mine in UNU Wider. So this book has many other country case studies using similar classification schemes. But I'll speak about what I've done since this book, which is about Indonesia-India comparison. So this is something that we pick up from that book. Now, what we need to understand, as I was saying at the beginning, our labor markets in developing countries are multi-tiered. That's very important to understand, and that helps us understand what a job ladder might be about. You have to also understand that you have to make the distinction between self-employment and wage employment. That's also very important. And you have to also recognize that formal jobs are the most favored and lower-tier informal jobs are the least favored. Now, having said that, one has to be careful because there might be a worker who might prefer not to be in the formal sector. In fact, in Latin America, it's actually quite common. So for example, you're a car mechanic. You're working in the Ford multinational company on a 9-to-5 wage job. You decide, well, actually, I don't want to work in a 9-to-5 job. I want to work in the informal sector and start my own company, own repair shop. So I exit the formal sector and I move to the upper informal sector. That happens. So it's not always that workers prefer to be in the formal sector because formal sector wage employment particularly is constrained that you've got to be there at a particular time of the day and you want more flexibility. So workers can exit from the formal sector and be in the upper informal sector. But it's very unlikely that workers might want to be the least in the lower informal sector. And that's an interesting question. Would there be any reasons why workers might want to be in the lower informal sector, lower tier informal sector? So that's the way we think about it. And the idea is that as you go up the job ladder, you should be moving out of poverty. And we find that in our work that we did in this earlier book that we did. So as you move out of the job ladder, potentially you're moving out of poverty. If you're a formal sector worker, very unlikely you'll be in poverty. If you're upper tier informal worker, depending on your earnings, you probably are not going to be in poverty. If you're a lower tier informal worker, almost surely you're in poverty, or at least very close to the poverty line. So that's the way to think about it. Now, so I'm not going to go through this diagram in detail, but what we did is that we had this schema which we used to categorize workers in different tiers. First, of course, you have the working age population. Then you have employed, unemployed, out of the labor force, standard labor economics terminology. Then among the employed, we have self-employed and wage employed. And out of the self-employed, some are actually registered with state authorities. They are formal self-employed, but the majority are not. And those who are not registered with state authorities are considered to be informal. And within the informal self-employed, there are those who are actually large enough to employ workers from outside the family. That will be upper tier informal self-employed. And there are other self-employed who are too small, household enterprises, own account workers, contributing family workers who would be lower tier informal self-employed. Then we move to wage employment, same thing. If you use the ILO definition, if you have got a secure job, social security, pensions, and so on, you're a formal worker. If you don't, you're an informal worker. And then within informality, if you have some de facto benefits, or you have some skills that are some occupational skills, you're probably going to be paid better, and you're upper tier informal. And then if you are essentially in a situation where you're a casual wage laborer, you are lower tier informal. Gary Fields made the point that those in the lower tier are in what we call free entry jobs, free entry, because you don't need any skills. Anybody can use manual labor. So the lower tier are essentially free entry jobs. But the upper tier, the informal labor market, there are barriers to entry. Barriers to entry in terms of education, some skills, some financial capital. If you want to be an employer, you have to have some financial capital to employ other workers. So the distinction that Gary Fields made between free entry jobs and barriers to entry jobs, even in the informal labor market, is very useful in my view, because then you can easily see what are considered to be lower tier jobs and what are considered to be upper tier jobs. Because that's very important in my view. Now the job ladder, as I said, you go up the ladder, probably moving out of poverty. Highest step in the ladder is formal work. Lowest step is lower informal work, whether self-employment, wage employment. So that's the job ladder. But the most important issue there is the job ladder can look in very different ways in different countries. You can have a job ladder which is quite broad at the top. Many workers in the formal sector, and not too many work the lower tier jobs. That's an ideal situation if you have to have a job ladder in your own country. Or you could have a job ladder that's very narrow at the top. There are very few jobs in the formal sector, and most workers are in the lower tier. And the question is, what can we expect for Indonesia and India? Which kind of job ladder fits these two countries? Is it the one on the right, where the broad at the top and narrow at the bottom? Or is it the one at the left, which is narrow at the top and broad at the bottom? And for that, of course, we have to look at data, understand how exactly workers are placed along the ladder. Now, so that's one point, important point. The second important point is that you could still have two different labor markets side by side, self-employment and wage employment. And you might have a broad ladder for self-employment and a narrow ladder of wage employment, and vice versa, because we often have segmented labor markets. Workers cannot move around that easily. So if you're self-employed, not easy to find a job as a wage worker. If you're a wage employed, not easy to start your own enterprise. So you can have segmented labor markets where you can have two different ladders in the same country for wage employment and self-employment. That's what's important to keep in mind. And of course, the question that we all want to ask is the question of whether or not the ladder is broken or not. Just let me put up the picture. It's going to come up soon. And a broken ladder is a situation where a lot of workers in the lower tier, they can't move up. Whatever reasons, they can't move up. And they're stuck. Similarly, it might be the upper tier, but you cannot also move up to formal level. So your lower tier, you cannot move the upper tier. Your upper tier cannot move the formal level, formal step, formal work. So you're stuck somewhere in between. And how broken the ladder is tells you how likely it is that you, working as a lower tier wage worker or self-employed, are likely to be in poverty, and also your children and your grandchildren. How much it will be over across generations that you won't likely to see that family always be in the lower tier. So what about mobility? Do they move up? And who moves up at what time? So that's a broken job ladder. We're going to try and understand that, again, for Indonesia, India. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because this was what was the data-intensive part. So I had two very good research assistants to help me do this, one from Indonesia and one from India, working with SACANAS surveys here and working with the Indian Employment Service in India. They were both based in these two countries. And what they had to do was to try to use similar schema to classify workers. The coding of this, the coding strategy we used, everything is there in a working paper from UNU Wider. It just got published yesterday. It's on our website. So if you're interested in knowing the coding that we had to do, it was quite meticulous, quite painstaking, quite difficult, actually, to do this coding, using SACANAS survey instruments for Indonesia and using the employment survey instrument, unemployment survey instruments for India. Fortunately, in most cases, in these two countries, we feel we got it right. For example, wage employment versus self-employment, we pretty much think we got it right. For lower tier informal wage employment, lower tier informal self-employment, we think we got it right because the questions were very clear there. What was tricky was upper tier versus formal. That was tricky because we did not have information or registration of the enterprise in SACANAS survey instrument or whether workers have social security or not. So we had to use proxies, especially in Indonesia, using occupation codes. So we put classified workers who were professionals, technical workers, as formal, and the rest occupational codes were upper informal, except manual laborers who were, of course, obviously lower tier informal. So that was a tricky bit. The upper informal, formal classification was tricky. But we did a lot of validation checks and so on, and I think, again, in my view, we are not too far away from what might have been the case. We had actual information on firm registration and also workers' social security benefits. So that's something to think about. But it's worth thinking that how one can progress on this work going forward. Okay, so now I'm going to very quickly go over this part because most of you are aware of this. Indonesia has been following orthodox economic management for a long time, since the new order, after the new order in 1966. There's been a major exporter of labor-intensive manufacturing goods since the early 1980s. India had a very, very socialist or command and control economy till 1991, and then, as I mentioned earlier, there were reforms. But India never really did well in manufacturing, and certainly not in labor-intensive manufacturing. That's been a big problem in India. What they did well is in tradable services, IT, and that has been a big source of growth in India since 1991 or so. So India has certainly the differentiation in the economic policy outcomes is on labor-intensive manufacturing for Indonesia, at least for quite a long time, and tradable services for India more recently. And if you look at GDP per capita and inequality, you do see the differences there. So again, yeah, there you go. GDP per capita, Indonesia's GDP per capita since the 1990s has more or less been higher than India. There's been some catching up. India's grown quite fast since 1990 after the reforms. And Indonesia, of course, had the Asian financial crisis in between. And you can see the big blip in the blue, Indonesia, and red for India. But generally, the per capita incomes do differ. Interestingly enough, Indonesia has had lower inequality, income inequality, using the Gini coefficient than India. Though both countries have seen an increase in inequality in more recent years, in the last 10, 15 years, Indonesia is a little bit of a downturn more recently. So inequality in India has been higher than that in Indonesia, even though Indonesia has had higher per capita income. Again, worth keeping that in mind. Okay, so that's just to do with the broad stylized facts. Now let's look at the job ladder for the two countries. I'm just going to bring that up, hopefully soon. Okay, all right, just very quickly, employment structure. This is pretty much what I said a little bit earlier. So employment structure, agriculture is still important in both countries, but definitely Indonesia, there are more workers now out of agriculture. Around 30% are still in agriculture, using 2018 data from the Economic Transformation Database that UNU-wide has put together. India, around 40%. So that's one big change, one difference. The second difference is that, as you can see from the orange bars, there are more workers in manufacturing in Indonesia than India. In fact, in India, that particular orange bar does not increase in size. Or for Indonesia, even for this 20 years or so, or 30 years or so, it increases in size. Number two. Number three, what's also interesting is that the gray bar, which is the non-manufacturing industry, which includes mining, but also includes construction, is actually increased quite a bit in India, not so much in Indonesia. Now you might say that's a bit strange, because Indonesia is done very well in mining. Well, mining is not labor intensive, but in India, the part that has the reason why India's increased non-manufacturing industry is because construction employment is increased significantly in India. And construction in India is very low productivity. So that's another interesting difference between these two countries' employment structure going forward. And of course, the question is, what does this imply for the job ladder? Okay, I'm just going to skip this graph. I'm just going to show you the job ladder now. So the job ladder, okay. Let's spend a bit of time looking at this. So if you look at the job ladder, what you see, so I'm looking at now 2 years in time. I'm going to take the first year, I have the data for each country, and the last year, just to not have the years in between, to make it simple to understand. So what do you see in Indonesia? Let's start with Indonesia. Let's start at the top. Top is formal wage employment. That's the light green. That's increased, doubled its share in this 20-odd years, doubled its share from 10% to 20%. The next orange, the next line, the bar is formal self-employment, hardly visible. And that's true we find in all the other countries we looked at in the book I mentioned. Then we have upper informal wage employment and upper informal self-employment. Again, you can see that especially upper employment, wage employment, more or less the same, hasn't changed. And then interestingly, what we find is that lower tier wage employment, self-employment, that share has decreased over time. And you can see that the part that's increasing is lower tier wage employment, and lower tier self-employment is reducing. Now, in 2020, there was still around 60% of workers in the lower tier, 3 times more than the formal workers, 3 times more. So even in 2020, there were much more workers in lower tier of the labor market, whether in wage employed or self-employed, doesn't matter, in Indonesia. Look at India. In India, the formal wage employment has increased, but not very much. And that's one big difference, which we'll talk about a bit more. Upper informal, which is upper informal wage employment, has increased in India compared to Indonesia. And what is striking is, in the lower tier, in India, wage employment has actually shrunk, or more or less the same. Lower tier self-employment is actually got larger. So there is a big difference here right away. In both, on the top end of the job ladder, more formal wage jobs in Indonesia than India, and at the bottom end of the job ladder, where we see differences in composition of lower tier jobs. In India, by the time we get to 2022, we still have about 70% of workers in lower tier jobs, wage employment, self-employment. Still a very large proportion, and definitely larger than Indonesia's. But the point I want to make here is, both these countries have narrow at the top job ladders and are very broad at the bottom. And that broad at the bottom, narrow at the top, has got a little bit better in Indonesia over time compared to India, but hasn't really changed the structure of this nature of the job ladder. So that's an important point to make here. Okay, moving forward to looking at some other things. So the point was self-employment and wage employment. So self-employment, over time, as countries grow richer and more productive, self-employment decreases. And that we see in Indonesia. So the wage employment is the orange bar, blue is self-employment. You can see wage employment increasing over these 20 years in Indonesia. But interestingly, in India, we don't see that. In this period in India, we actually see that self-employment is roughly the same. So this is a very interesting difference in these two countries. Even though they have both have seen rapid economic growth and subtle transformation, Indonesia has done if you could say, a better job in taking workers out of self-employment to wage employment, but not India. And that's an interesting question which I'm going to come back to later. Now, just very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on the descriptives, but one thing that's striking in both countries is the fact that the lower tier is a huge concentration of women. So for Indonesia, the lower tier informal self-employment, lower tier informal wage employment, especially self-employment, large proportion of women, in fact, more than India's. In the case of India also, lower tier informal self-employment and lower tier informal wage employment, big shares of women. Now, one has to be careful when comparing these two graphs. Why? Because Indonesia has higher female labor force participation rates. So part of the reason why we see more women in the lower tier is partly because there are more women in the participating in the labor market. But having said that, what we do see is a rather significant gender disparity where women are not in the upper tier jobs or also in self-employment, though women are in formal wage employment in both countries. So that's the gender issue. On the urban-rural issue, what's interesting is that in Indonesia, the lower tier is increasingly found in urban areas. Indonesia is urbanizing. Urbanization rates have increased quite significantly. And is over time, you can see in the lower tier of the labor market, more and more workers in urban areas. But that is not the case in India. In India, most workers who are in the lower tier are still in rural areas. So in Indonesia, urbanization has been faster, 10 percentage point difference in urbanization rates in Indonesia and India. But what we're finding is that increasing in Indonesia, the lower tier, which is still a big chunk, as I said, 70% of the labor force of workers are in the lower tier, increasingly now urbanized. And that's a really interesting issue, but we can think a bit on the policy side. Okay, so I want to know education. What we are seeing is pretty obvious. Education expanded in both countries significantly in the last few decades. Lower tier jobs, before most workers were not educated or elementary schooling, that has fallen. But you can still see that those who had no or very little education still are in the lower tier. That you can see from the graphs here, lower tier informal self-employment, lower tier informal wage employment. Yes, it has fallen over time, both countries, but it's also true that those workers who are not so educated are in the lower tier. Now, I can skip this graph. Now let me sort of talk about earnings. Now, the problem with calculating earnings in this kind of wage, with this kind of surveys is self-employment earnings is very difficult to calculate. We have wage data for both the countries over time. We don't have self-employment earnings data over time. And I'm going to show you the last years that we have some data. Now, real wages, Indonesia, real wages, India. One somewhat puzzling thing that we found was that in the 2001, lower tier informal wage workers were paid a little bit more than upper tier informal wage workers. We think it's to do with the aftermath of the crisis and a big movement of formal workers to the informal labor market. That's still, I mean, we need to think about it a bit more. But if you look at the last year, 2020, you can see the clear job ladder. Formal workers paid the most, upper informal paid the next, and lower tier paid the least. And if you look at the wage gaps between formal, upper tier, informal, lower tier, the gaps, absolute gaps, have increased over time. So disparities have actually increased over time, and there's some work that shows that earnings inequality has also increased over time, reflecting this. India, actually, the lower tier has been catching up a little bit with the formal and upper tier, but even then, by the time we get to 2022, the gaps, the absolute gaps in wages is it's increased over this 20-odd years. So in both those countries, we see a clear job ladder in wages, and we seem to see increasing disparity between what formal workers are paid, upper informal workers are paid, and lower tier workers are paid in wage employment. You might say, what about self-employment? As I said, that we have limited data there. We had this for 2020 for Indonesia and for India 2022. And you can see that at least using this 2020 data, Sakana survey data, we can see that lower tier informal self-employment are paid much more than lower tier wage employment. Now, this is the COVID period, could be e-commerce coming in and so on. But there is this interesting disparity between self-employed earnings and wage employment earnings. Same thing in India. Generally, we find in India also the self-employed are paid more than the wage employed, mostly in the formal, upper informal, less evident in the lower informal, though in the lower informal actually is still a significant difference. So that's an interesting thing, that we do seem to see some segmentation between self-employment and wage employment in both these countries, using the data that we have, which has all of these workers' earnings in one place. So that's interesting, and I think that shows again the disparities that we see between these different kind of workers. Okay, I want to now just, how much time do I have? Oh, 10 minutes, okay, good, okay. So I want to just sort of give you some simple correlates of what explains why workers are. So this is not causal. I'm just estimating multi-noble logit and ordered logit models. So very, very, very basic, really. I'm pooling the data together for all the cross-sections. So you have repeated cross-sections. We're pooling the data for Indonesia, 2001, 2010, 2020, 3 cross-sections. Because we did it year by year, round by round, we didn't get much of a difference in results. So the data, that particular, we do have that individual level, round level results, but it doesn't really change very much if we use the pooled data. India also, we have 4 rounds of the data, 1988 to 2022. So we pool the data there also. And what we find is that the correlates are pretty much the same in these 2 countries. What are the correlates? If you're a woman, you are more likely to be in the lower tier, significantly more likely. The only difference is that when you do this in multi-noble logit models, so there we have 6 work status, the 3 in the self-employment, 3 in wage employment. There we see that using multi-noble logit models, that women are also likely to be in formal wage employment. But if we do ordered logit, we put the 2 categories of formal self-employment and wage employment together, we see that women are much more likely to be the lower tier, because there are very few women in the upper tier of either self-employment, wage employment, and very few women in formal self-employment. So that's a real concern. How is it that in these 2 countries we see this major gender segregation going on in the labor market? Number one. Number 2, interestingly, and it is something we need explanation, we find that married workers are more in self-employment than in wage employment, using the multi-noble logit models. And when I use ordered logit models, we find that married workers, whether they're men or women, it doesn't matter, are in lower tier informal jobs. Again, interesting question. Why is that the case? And that's because here we have both men and women. It's not obvious to do with childcare issues or something else. But it was surprising to find that as a correlate, marital status seems to explain where you are in the job ladder. And then, of course, not surprisingly, education makes a difference. But education makes a difference in the sense that, of course, the more educated you are, the more likely you're going up the job ladder. But interestingly, we find that the returns to education, in other words, take 2 graduates, one in Indonesia, one in India. And we can compare graduate degrees, which you probably can't, but imagine there are 2 graduates. A graduate in Indonesia is more likely to be in formal employment compared to somebody in India. This could be because there are less jobs in the formal sector in India. But whatever it is, the returns to education in terms of where you are on the job ladder is higher in Indonesia than India. And that's also quite interesting, that education is important, but it has a different role, it's slightly different effects in these two countries. Okay, so just to conclude, we seem to see quite important similarities in labor market inequality in Indonesia and India, using comparable surveys, comparable classification schemes as much as possible. Of course, there are also all kinds of caveats here, but as much as possible, we seem to see similarities. Both have ladders that are narrow at the top and wide at the bottom, significantly wide at the bottom. As I said, 3 out of every 5 workers, 3 out of 4, 3 out of 5 workers in Indonesia and India are in lower tier jobs. Some in wage employment, in Indonesia more so, some in self-employment, India more so. Number one. Number two, both countries have significant disparities in wage earnings across workers at different tiers. And in India, we find some evidence of catching up. So lower tier wage workers are beginning to, not catching up in absolute terms, but relative terms catching up. But in Indonesia, we don't seem to find that evidence of catching up. But no matter what, we find that disparity in absolute term disparities in wage differences have increased in both these countries. So in both these countries, looking at our findings, inequality, if you wish to measure in terms of earnings inequality or wage inequality, has increased. That's number 2. Number 3, females and less educated workers occupy the lowest tier in both countries. And that is interesting in it. Finding the females being higher and more likely in lower tier informal is interesting because Indonesia has done better than India in getting women to work. But obviously, there is this issue that women are participating more in the labor market in Indonesia than India. In fact, the difference in labor force participation rates for females, I think it's 12 percentage points. 50%, I think, in Indonesia, 38% in India, around that ballpark number. But what has happened, it seems, that women are more likely to be the lower tier jobs in Indonesia, as also in India. And education, of course, is a big driver of all this. More education, more likely you're going to be going up the job ladder. Now, so there are similarities. What are differences? And they're quite important differences. First, Indonesia has done a better job of providing formal jobs, especially formal wage jobs, twice, in fact, than India at roughly the same time. So that's probably because there has been this labor-intensive manufacturing success in Indonesia, creating more wage employment in the formal sector. That might explain why we see Indonesia doing better in providing formal wage jobs than India. So that's one possible explanation. Secondly, very surprisingly, actually, in Indonesia, the move is from self-employment to wage employment and opposite, or more or less opposite for India. So there's a big difference here. So here in Indonesia, more likely you're going to find workers who are in wage employment than self-employment. And in India, you're going to find more likely you're going to find workers self-employment and not wage employment. And again, there's a question that we need to think more about. What can explain that? What I argue in this paper is it could be linked to more dynamism in Indonesia's labor market because of labor-intensive manufacturing, because generally the view is that as you have more labor-intensive manufacturing, there is more wage employment. That might explain why in Indonesia we have seen more wage employment created across all tiers of the market than in India, where we haven't had success in India, labor-intensive manufacturing. That's one possible reason. There could be others. And the third thing is that, another interesting difference is that lower tier informal work in India is mostly a rural phenomenon. Urban workers are mostly on the formal or upper informal. While Indonesia, increasingly, lower tier informal work is urban, as in fact, the rural population also shrinks. That's an interesting difference between these two countries. And therefore, the policy question is, increasingly as cities in Indonesia are becoming, where workers are showing up who are in lower tier jobs, what does one do about that? So I wanted to now spend a bit of time in policy implications because that's important. Oops, sorry. And I think the way to think about this, and I didn't have much time to speak about this when I presented the job ladder framework, there are two ways to think about a job ladder. One is to think about how do we increase the size of the steps at the top, and that is to do with demand-side policies, because the more you can have demand-side policies like labor-intensive manufacturing, like maybe even service sector, tradable services growth, there are more jobs at the top of the ladder. The demand-side policies are very important in both countries. How do we get to that situation? That's an open question, and I don't think I have an answer to that. But certainly, you have to think about demand-side policies, because if the ladder's upper step is fixed in size, no matter what you do, you're not going to have people moving up. You've got to expand the size of the top ladder, the formal jobs, and also the upper tier jobs, so that people in the lower tier can move to the next rung of the ladder, upper tier possibly, and maybe at some point possibly the formal jobs. So that's number one. Supply side, education still remains important, particularly investment in secondary and graduate education. We saw already, I didn't have the time to present the slide actually, that most workers who are formal have graduate degrees in Indonesia and India. So if you don't have a graduate degree, it's quite unlikely that you're going to have a formal job. So secondary education is important, but to go to the top of the ladder, you need to have graduate education there. And so that's something that you have to think about. Now, at the end of it, the whole thing, no matter what you do, you cannot move every worker from the lower tier, the upper tier, or to the formal job market, formal work. So you have to also think about those in the lower tier. Now, there, of course, and it's speculative, you think of minimum wage enforcement, for example, potentially to protect the lower tier jobs, wage workers. In particular, you could think about ways to create more livelihoods for the lower tier. There are many different options out there of providing credit to small household enterprises and so on. I don't want to get into all of that, but you should not ignore the lower tier, because the lower tier is likely to be left behind, as we have seen in these two countries. In these 20 years that we've seen in these two countries where we have reasonable economic growth, especially Indonesia after 2010, India from 1990, you have to think about this lower tier and think systematically, what can we do to target this group in particular, as you start also think about creating more jobs at the top end of the job ladder. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kunasen. The main takeaway from the presentation is even though the number of formal jobs in Indonesia, yes, takeaways, especially for Indonesia, the number is the formal jobs in Indonesia is almost twice than in India, but both India and Indonesia have a narrow on a little narrow a little in the top of the ladder and wide at the bottom. It can be concluded also that tackling the informal workers is very challenging, since the inequality is growing and also it's multi-tiered. And the investment in education, especially in graduate and secondary, is very important. So thank you so much, Professor. And now I would like to invite the first discussion, Ibu Maria Monica Wihaja. So the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's with my great pleasure that I'm discussing Professor Sunal Sen's excellent paper on labor market inequality in Indonesia and India. The topic is very timely, as I will elaborate in my presentation. There are many similarities and differences between India and Indonesia. Indonesia and India are poised to be the third and fourth largest economies in the world by 2050. Both countries aspire to be a high-income country in their 100th anniversary of independence, 2045 for Indonesia and 2047 for India. As the largest and third largest democracy, India and Indonesia also share similar political features. President Modi and President Jokowi are now among the world's most popular presidents in the world, with an approval rating of about 75 to 80%. However, Indonesia are at a crossroads. Among the major challenges that could potentially hinder these countries from reaching their dreams is what is being discussed this morning, namely labor market inequality and vulnerable jobs. Indonesia and, is this the right slide? Yes. Indonesia and India have been enjoying relatively high economic growth. However, this rate of growth may not be enough to bring these countries to high-income countries by 2045 and 2047. They need a higher growth to become rich before they age. Both countries are currently enjoying demographic dividends. As you can see from the graph, about 68% of their population is in their productive age, between 15 to 64 years old. But in about 10 to 15 years, the share of the working age population will start to decline, and demography will start to weigh down on their economic growth. Today, for every 2 working age persons, there are 1 independent person, either a child below 15 years old or an older person aged 65 and above. However, this ratio will start to increase in about 5 to 10 years from now, especially because of the increase in old age dependency. In both countries, the society will start to age. And once they start to age, there's no turning back, just like Japan in the 1990s and China in 2010. Although aging is a sign of longer and healthier lives, if Indonesia and India fail to invest enough in necessary reforms in their younger, high-growth economy, including by providing enough good jobs for their young population, an aging society will also be a ticking time bomb. Growing faster than the current growth rate for India and Indonesia may require major economic policy reforms. Indonesia has been growing at about 5% in the last decade, while India about 7%. However, economic and industrial policies in Indonesia and India in the past couple of decades have not created enough good jobs to expand their middle-class population. For example, Indonesia's downstream policy in the nickel smelter industry and India's product-based manufacturing strategy. Although both countries' efforts to industrialize are a step in the right direction, they are mostly targeted at capital-intensive instead of labor-intensive industries. Investment climate in both countries are still relatively poor compared to their competitor countries, while trade and investment barriers are high. Human capital is lagging behind. According to World Bank's Human Capital Index in 2020, which uses health and education indicators to predict future productivity, Indonesian children today will only live up to 54% of their full productivity potential, while Indian children will only live up to 49% of their full productivity potential, compared to 88% for Singapore and 69% for Vietnamese children. As a result of incoherent economic and industrial policies, FDI to GDP ratio remains sluggish, while the share of manufacturing to GDP in both countries, despite their industrialization efforts, has declined. To grow faster than the current economic growth trend, both countries also need to invest in R&D. However, R&D ratio to GDP is only 0.24% in Indonesia and 0.69% for India. This is in contrast with China's 2.25% and South Korea's 4%. Furthermore, COVID-19 further robbed their demographic dividends. Let me give you an example from Indonesia. Indonesia experienced huge excess death of 736,000, 5 times their officially reported COVID-19 death tolls. Indonesia also experienced a huge learning loss. Indonesian fourth graders in 2023 lost 11 months of learning for both math and language studies, but students from poor households lost 18 and 27 months. As a result, Indonesian men and women will experience a significant lifetime loss of earnings compared to what it would have been without the pandemic. Moreover, unemployment rate has not come back to the pre-pandemic level, and by March 2023, a third of Indonesian workers were still earning less than the pre-pandemic. The COVID-19 also hit India hard, so we can imagine a similar picture. Digital technology and transformation has been turbocharged during the COVID-19 pandemic. Digital technological and AI investment bring economic growth and productivity. In Indonesia, investment in digital manufacturing, digital trade, and digital services has grown significantly since 2012. However, there are risks from digital transformation. Automation and AI are labor augmenting, but they can also be labor replacing, especially when the workforce is not equipped with skills that could complement these emerging technologies. This technological development risks replacing labor and polarizing the labor market. For example, evidence from Indonesia shows that investment in the digital manufacturing sector favors the high-income workers. The middle class in Indonesia and India is a promising segment of their domestic markets. While the poor and vulnerable population may be eligible for social assistance and the upper class can benefit from their capital gains, the middle class depends most of their income from their labor. There could be a serious social crisis in the middle class if the economy fails to create enough good jobs and opportunity for them to climb up the job ladder. In fact, the share of jobs that could afford middle-class way of living in Indonesia has been halved since 2016, as you can see from the graph on the left-hand side. Consequently, the share of the middle-class population has also declined from 23% in 2018 to 17% in 2023, while the share of the economically insecure population has increased despite a declining poverty. Similarly, the middle class in India is also in precarious position. For example, in 2021, the Pew Research Center found that Indian middle class contracted during the COVID-19 pandemic. Both India and Indonesia have succeeded in rolling out huge social assistance, facilitated by digitalization. In Indonesia, there are several targeted social assistance programs, from the conditional cash transfers to food vouchers, while prices of electricity, fuel, LPG, and fertilizer are heavily subsidized. Transfers to targeted recipients have been digitalized, such as the food voucher program. Indonesia is rolling out its digital ID and the social registry system, and that are constantly being reformed to better target recipients. In the future, we can expect that social assistance system will even be more robust. In India, there are universal identity scheme, unified payment interface to make real-time payments, and personal data management schemes to keep tax documents. The homogeneous payment system for social assistance and the homogeneous tax systems create a single market for the Indian economy. By 2022, real-time digital payment accounted for 46% of total transactions in India. Social assistance in Indonesia and India is significant. In India, welfare payments account for 3% of GDP, while in Indonesia, subsidies alone accounted for 3% of GDP. However, just simply giving fish and not the fishing rods may neither be fiscally sustainable nor desirable for the people. The reconfiguration of the global supply chains, especially away from China, creates opportunity to grab some market share in the global manufacturing for India and Indonesia. Both countries roll out generous tax incentives and subsidies for investment in these emerging industries. For example, Indonesia's tax incentive for the nickel metal industry and India's subsidy scheme for semiconductor. However, success in reaping this new economic opportunity will depend on improving investment climate, for example, removing some of local content requirements in Indonesia, infrastructure and logistics, and workforce in these two countries. One area that offers a promising future is digitally delivered service exports, involving supplies of services delivered remotely over computer networks. Such services could range from the outsourcing of back office operations, including data entry and call centers, to programming and web content services intermediated via digital platforms, to chip design. Globally, there is growing demand for digitally delivered services export in Indonesia and globally. And the growth of digitally delivered services export surpasses the growth of other services exports. So as a concluding remark, Indonesia and India are at a crossroads with high level of informality and vulnerable jobs. While they have young demography, demographic dividend may run out very soon. And to increase economic growth and create more and better jobs, there are emerging economic opportunities arising from the reconfigurations of global supply chains, mainly away from China. However, there are strong headwinds coming from the risk of labor replacing AI and advancement and rising protectionist policies globally. Both countries have rolled out huge social assistance that boost the popularity of their presidents, but this cannot replace good job creation, especially for the middle class. Going forward, both countries need to focus more on and invest in labor-intensive instead of capital-intensive industrialization strategy, while turning global challenges in geopolitical rivalry, climate change, and digital technology into opportunities. So now let me give you, give some of my comments for the lecture paper. So I think the paper could maybe perhaps highlight more that Indonesia experienced premature deindustrialization after the Asian financial crisis in 1997, and is no longer pursuing labor-intensive export-oriented industrial policy like it used to be in the 1980s and 1990s. And I think the paper could also discuss more on the impact of the COVID-19 and digitalization on the labor market. For example, the constant share of the upper-tier informal jobs may be due to automation or job polarization that impacts sales and production workers. Women may seem to be disadvantaged in the labor market, but perhaps the question is whether we should monetize work that women do at home. And I think the paper could discuss more about India's labor regulations that has been hindering the growth of the formal and wage employment. Minimum wage is not binding in Indonesia due to high non-compliance. So increasing minimum wage may not necessarily protect workers, but may potentially cut employment. And some of the technical comments for the paper is first on the definition of informality. I think it may be good to have a matrix or a table or a chart to explain the definition. I think you have this in your longer paper, Professor Sen. And the World Bank Jobs Report actually calculated the rate of informality in Indonesia using the new definitions of informality proposed by ICLS 17, which is similar to your chart using the Fields, etc. 2023 paper. And we came up with the number 75%. So this is lower than the 85.2% that you quoted in your presentation. And also, there are different definitions that you use for India and Indonesia. So I think this could be elaborated how it may impact the comparison of the analysis. And on the periods of the analysis, Indonesia's studying periods is after the Asian financial crisis 1997 reforms, while India's studying period is before their economic reforms in 1991. So that could impact perhaps the comparative analysis. Indonesia's ending period is during the COVID-19, where some of the labor market indicators went haywire, while India's ending period is after the pandemic, so that could also impact the comparative analysis. Also, I think when we talk about job ladder, it may be useful and may be more insightful if we can use individual level panel analysis instead of just looking the numbers at the aggregate level. I also would like to highlight that income data is not available for all workers, at least in Indonesia Sakenas data. So Sakenas data doesn't have income data for employers nor unpaid family workers. Also, just to take a note that urbanization in Indonesia may not mean people moving from rural to urban areas, but simply mean that there is a change in the status of many rural areas as they develop. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Maria Monica. And now I would like to invite Pak Dewa. Please, Pak Dewa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hanum, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues here. And I'm really humble here. And for the first opportunity being discussion in this prominent event, thank you very much, NU Indonesia Project, my alma mater here. So like happy to see several seniors here. So today I would like to discuss Professor Sen's paper from three ways. First, I would like to discuss why this topic is so important, and hopefully we'll be able to invite some of the audience here, especially our beloved students, to extend further the analysis in this area so we can have more understanding about the labor market, particularly in Indonesia, and of course we can learn from other countries like India. The second one also would like to discuss some of the comments directly related to the paper. But Monica already highlighted quite a lot, so I don't want to adding up further, just adding up a couple of things that might be interesting from the perspective of Indonesia experience. And then the last one is about the policy. So first, why this topic is important? At least we may see the topic, actually the centers of this topic, trying to compare between the low tier and high tier informal and formal workers. Both India and Indonesia having similar situation in terms of the size of this kind of workers as a result of the demographic transition in both countries. So if we want to observe this kind of phenomena, at least we may see from two different debates what will be the challenge of this type of jobs and what kind of potential that we may elaborate further to gain benefit for the workers. First, about the challenge. Particularly, we may see the challenge for those low-tier workers, both informal and formal workers. The low-tier informal workers constituting like the biggest portions of the workers here in Indonesia as well as in India. And we may see, and we already seen a lot of the discussion about it, what kind of condition these kind of workers facing every day. They have a precarious job, so uncertain income, and inadequate social protection, as well as the stagnant wage or earnings that they earn. The other things that maybe become more micro analysis that we may focus on is how they are facing poverty traps. They are unable to improve their welfare conditions. So this paper also trying to understand why are they facing inability to climb up the job ladder because of several aspects. This is also one we may extend further in the analysis, and also skill development opportunities. So that's the challenge, particularly for the low tiers workers. On the other hand, when we expect they will climb up to the higher job career, we may see that there is an opportunities or dynamics, changes within the higher tiers workers, both the formal or informal. So we may see in many occasions, Indonesia in particular, and India as well here, having a higher economic growth, or I put a question mark here, stable economic growth, then it leading to new industries, new job opportunities, or different kind of jobs that may be created due to this economic growth. So for the higher tier formal workers, they are benefited for having better wage, job security, or even better access to the social protection. So it's totally contrast to the informal low-tier workers. And the last one that Monica also already discussed about the digital technology. So this type of workers, the higher-tier workers, also may benefited by this technological development. They will be more able to adapt the technology, so they may have faster improvement compared to the low-tier workers. So in this point, like, it will be very important and might be very interesting to highlight and extend further our analysis in comparison between these two groups, and how will be their condition and the dynamics across type of jobs may change the compositions of our labor market. So now I would like to join into the second one about the comments of the lecture paper. There are three generic comments on this. First is about the definition, but I would like to bring this definition a little bit simpler. I mean, in the paper, we may be interested to extend further to focus on how we define this type of workers. It's not directly identifiable, not to mention the statistic itself. It's quite complex. The definition is quite a lot. So we need to have a further explanation or the table or on how to put the combinations, both the tiers and the worker status, the formal and informal. Just two examples on how we define this category of workers. This is based on works by Rizky, Surya Dharma, and Surya Heidi 2023. This is just an example on how we can identify the status of the workers on the top panel, as well as the occupation or the work type on the row panels on the left. And then after that, we can identify which one actually have a high tier or low tier. So this is very important to extend further, especially if we want to focus on the dynamic of the workers. Some of the new jobs might be very difficult to be allocated in which part of the tiers, or whether there is a shifting of the definition of the status from informal to formal or the other way around. For Indonesian experience, for example, maybe we can see for the students here may be familiar with this table. So again, this is an invitation to all of us to be able to use a basic matrix of the comparison for formality and informality of job across status as well as occupation. I'm really sorry this is still in Indonesian language, but at least for us, it will be very good invitation for us to elaborate further how we identify these low and high tiers and what will be the dynamics happening within this kind of jobs. So this is interesting, and Professor Sen's paper already initiated this discussion, and it will be very important for us to extend further, at least for Indonesian case. So that's the first comment. The second one is about the urbanization, about how actually the changing of status of the location within Indonesia. But as far as I understand, if we see our demographic transformation here in Indonesia, the urbanization process here in Indonesia is mostly due to, one particular area is become urbanized, more urbanized than before. So it's not necessarily people moving from rural to urban area. In our own language, like we can say that semakin mengkota. So everybody become more cities, become more citizens. So then it would be very interesting if we are able to extend our analysis in this paper to see how actually the dynamic of job tiers as well as the status when we do an analysis, parallel analysis on job mobility or labor mobility. Okay, where workers now are more likely to work, and luckily I'm already having some of the initial analysis that we compare labor mobility across districts and provinces. Why this is important? Because it shows similar patterns by gender, by type of education, and by skills. For example, we can see here like mobile workers or workers who are moving across district or provinces, usually dominated by workers who have upper middle and tertiary education level. Here in Indonesia, we have 2 years data, 2008 and 2018. I'm in the process to update the latest one. As we can see, on the right panel for each graph shows that there is an increase of the upper middle tertiary education workers who move further across district, or even on the right, in the left province, on the right is across district or municipalities. So this is by education level. The second one, which is quite related to this paper, is about the formality. So those who are formal workers, they are more mobile. They are more able to move themselves across province or across districts. So again, this is following the patterns of job mobility in terms of the low and high tiers and job status. So again, we need to extend further this kind of analysis to see more in detail. The last one is about the type of skill. So if we categorize those education and we extend further by categorizing low and middle and high skill, we see that they're still dominated by low skill workers, although there has been an increasing trend of high skill workers for between each province level. So this kind of mobility provide us more information about how we understand this job ladder situation, because some of those workers who are able to climb up the ladders might also experiencing, shifting to a different location to be able to gain those new type of job. So the last one, since I'm from Demography Institute, so I always need to talk about population structures. So one additional analysis that might be interested actually, we may see different groups of workers in terms of age. As we can see here, this is one example, the proportions of workers by age, those who are working in informal workers, increasingly occurs in the older group workers. So when we see the low tiers of workers and high tiers of workers between informal to formal workers, we may experiencing that those who are young are more able to climb up the ladders, while the old one might be stuck in one step of the ladders. It needs to be proved further, but again, probably this is an invitation to all of us to extend further our analysis and see how these age structures may explain the dynamic of the low tiers, high tiers status workers. So the last one is about the policy-related discussion. At least we may also identify 3 key points related to the employment policies. Number one is about the formalizations and social protection. As we can see in the beginning, those who are in a higher tier formal workers, they are more able to get social protections. So the discussion here maybe need to extend our analysis on those who are low tiers informal workers who still not yet covered enough by the protections. And as for the formalizations, Professor Sen's paper already discussed about the industrializations, but probably from the supply side, we also need to understand how the formalization of workers need to be analyzed further from the supply side, whether it's through the education, whether through training, which is coming to the second point, about the skill development and training. Will these two policies, orientations like skill development and training will be able to formalize most of our workers? So we need to push the government's effort to promote formalization through skill development and training, particularly the vocational training programs, as well as how to address the mismatch of the job market demands and available talents in the market. Finally, about inclusive growth, we need to understand or discuss a little bit further on how to apply some of the employment policy that are able to prioritize inclusivity and address the uniqueness of the vulnerable groups in the labor markets, as well as how we trying to promote the equal opportunities and reducing barriers across these groups. I think that's it from my side. And again, this is very important and interesting paper. Thank you very much for having me here, and good day.
Thank you, Pak Dewa. And now I would like to invite Professor Sunal Sen to give a response to the discussion.
Thank you for a really excellent set of comments. I can't do justice to answering all of them. I won't have time for that. But I'll obviously take this comments on for the paper that I'm writing for the Bulletin for Indonesian Economic Studies. But I want to make some points, methodological points, because I think that's important in this audience, because a lot of you are students here. So you can look at the job ladder using panel data, which is what we did in the job ladder book, which we published last year, as I mentioned. So there is a chapter in Indonesia, there's a chapter in India. The chapter in Indonesia uses ILFS. I think you cite that paper, Variski et al. Chapter in India, which I was the co-author, uses another panel data for India called the Indian Human Labour Survey. So panel data allows you to track workers across different parts of the labour market, but there is a problem, because panel data, at least ILFS and we have somebody who works extensively on ILFS, and IHTS in India, don't provide the kind of granularity on labour market work status that a big labour force survey does. Cycleness in Indonesia, employment surveys in India give you the size, the representativeness, and also the granularity, which is very important when you're doing this, when you're putting workers in different parts of the level or the different tiers. So I decided, therefore, to use repeated cross-sections, because that's what we have, Cycleness and IHTS, because they give you a different insight. They don't give you the mobility, the transition that's already been done for these two countries, already in this book that we published. But I think that there are a lot of benefits of using existing labour force surveys, secondary labour force surveys like Cycleness, Indonesia, like the employment survey in India, to try and do this work. So I was also trying to make a methodological point that let's not forget this big level 4 surveys because these are really, really important for us. They are nationally representative. They cover the whole country. They are done very carefully. And we know that ILFS has its strengths, of course, panel data, but SACNS has its strengths. So that was a methodological point. So the second point is on the question about rural to urban, where you're just essentially making a location urban because that area has now become enough urban. The same thing is happening in India. A lot of so-called villages or rural areas have become urban using this shift that's happened over time and India is becoming more urbanized. But there is that problem that even in India, still workers are not, even with this definitional change, are still in rural areas. Which suggests that it's not just purely definitional changes happening in these two countries. Something else is happening in India compared to Indonesia. And I think that's worth asking what exactly is going on in these two countries. Why we should expect also in India, because of this definitional change, more and more workers should be, lower tier workers should be in urban areas. So I think that's another important point to think about. I'm not going to get into the other points, especially the first Monica raised, which I think needs more time. But there's one thing I think that's a bit, it's a question I have for the audience actually. In India, we've seen massive increase in minimum wages. So from 2009 to 2018-20, 450% in real terms, 450% in real terms, minimum wages. And these are, all I'm using is the agricultural minimum wage, the lowest of all the minimum wages in India. India have minimum wages by jobs. So agricultural workers are paid the least, and they have seen a 450% increase in minimum wages, and there's a lighthouse effect. Every other worker's minimum wages also increased, right? Now, what we found in India, and this is not part of this paper, a separate paper, we find that has led to a huge reduction in earnings inequality, where the lower paid workers are getting much more paid. So even with imperfect enforcement, India has a similar problem with enforcement as Indonesia. We seem to see that lower paid workers getting this increase in real terms, which might explain, in my view, not completely, in my view, why in India we seem to see lower tier workers, wage workers, wages are catching up towards the upper tier and the formal workers. But then we haven't, in the work I've done, there's no disemployment effects, zero effects on employment. Now, I don't know enough of the minimum wage literature in Indonesia, that why have we not seen these big increases in earnings in Indonesia among lower paid workers? Because Indonesia also has, since 2004, minimum wage has increased, and has there been disemployment effects? Open question, I can't answer that question. And one last point I want to make, because I don't have much time, is that the paper that my distinguished discussants read, the one that's coming out in BIES, takes away all the methodological notes, the coding strategies, the tables, the figures, all that's not there. Because it's coming on BIS, I was told by the editor and the referee, the editor sitting right in front of me, actually, one of the editors, that should not be there. So what I've done, get all of that in a separate working paper with a different title. So all of the coding strategies, the methodologies, the tables, everything is in a different paper, which is now, as I said, come out of a working paper. I had to do it because I do think that longer version of that paper, it's important for students, especially here, because they need to go and see what I did, or all of my collaborators also help me in this. Did you do it okay or not? That's an open question. But it's not in the BIS paper because there is no space in the BIS. That's a very simple fact. Okay, I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor. So actually, I see more than 5 questions on the Zoom, but I will give the opportunity to the audience here. So I will give to 2, Professor, ma'am, and then one more. Is there anyone else who want to raise a question to Professor Kunal? Okay, so please. Okay, who will give her the mic? No, it's not. It's not to clear.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have one question for Professor Kunal and Dan another question for all three of you. So I think I echo what Dewa said, that I think it will be interesting to see the analysis to have more intersectionality part of it, especially in the context of Indonesia. Region plays an important role in terms of how inequality plays out. And then in the context of India, I'm a big fan of Ambedkar. So he said once that caste system is not merely a division of labor, it is also a division of laborers. So I wonder how much is in the context of India, because culture also plays an important role in these kind of things. So how much in the context of India that the caste system drives the results in terms of the inequality? Because I think it's important to understand where are the vulnerable spots, especially given the current government that's become more and more far right in India, and whether the vulnerable spots also include the intersection of religion, the caste system, and gender, and all of those things. And for all of you three, I wonder, this is sort of like a challenge about the need for more and more GDP in order to reduce inequality. Whether with looming climate crisis in front of us, whether that is possible and ethical. So because also for the fact that we live in a world where 1% of the richest person own like almost 50% of the wealth of the world. Maybe the problem of inequality is not about getting more GDP, but whether how does the GDP is distributed. Especially recently, I read a newspaper or something, an article saying that actually with the money that, just like a real example, with the money that the US spent for Israel, they can actually solve the homelessness inside the country. So they can actually solve the inequality because of the homelessness, but they chose war over that kind of things. So there is the problem. I think my question is, what is the political economy dimension in all of this analysis? Because we cannot escape from the politics that drives all of these results. I guess that's my question. Thank you.
One else who want to ask Professor? Okay, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Samuel, one of the students in University of Indonesia, and I want to ask about the role of gender in this kind of inequality. If I remember correctly, earlier in the slides, I'm sorry, what's your name? The professor of the current paper.
Alsan?
Sorry.
Oh.
His name, yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot his name. Yeah, so the professor in one of the slides informed that apparently women have, on average, works in lower skilled jobs compared to men. Now, if I remember correctly, I once read an article that said apparently that female women's participation in higher education, such as college institutions, are equal or higher to men. So, however, it seems that this kind of higher education participation does not necessarily translate to higher average wages compared to men. Are there any particulars of why that is the case? Why, even though women might, have in some cases equal education, but they still receive on average lower wages or have worked in like lower paying jobs? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Professor and the discussion will give the response to the question.
Actually, let me pick up the gender question first, because it's a very important question. I'll come to the question on caste also. So on gender, I think that one important issue that was spearheaded actually by Monica in the first discussions was that if you look at the way we think about labor force participation, women's work, one of the problems with labor force surveys, which has now been recognized, is they don't take into account care work or what we call extra domestic duties like cooking, collecting firewood if you're a villager, if somebody living in a village. So those kind of work is not counted in standard surveys. This is true for any labor force survey. This is a problem we know. Now, one of the things in India which is quite remarkable, I think, because of they had a very strong sort of feminist economists very early on, who kept on saying to our national survey organization, the one that collects our employment surveys, that look, you can't miss this actually, you've got to take this into account. So India is actually, I think, unique in the developing world. They had those who do the surveys had a special module that asks respondents, do you do firewood collection, do you do cooking, do you do care recording, care work, and that is under a particular coding of the data, which is what is called extra domestic duties. So that allows for what I have a paper on this also, a broader definition of women's work. So women's work is not monetized work or even unpaid family work. It is also can take into account cooking and care and so on. It's important. Now I did the coding with that too, because I had that question, I had that information. Indonesia, the faculty service does not have that question. Like I said, it's unique that India had it, because India had these feminist scholars who are really very, very vocal in that respect. Now, when you introduce that question and then use those coding of the economic duties, we work the labor market tiers. What do you find? You find that even more so, women are in lower tier second employment. Because now extra domestic duties are now considered to be work, and women are most engaged in that, not men, right? Cooking, firewood collection, care, so on and so forth, right? So there is this question, I think that even a broader question, how should we define women's work, right? If we use a broader definition, which is, I think we should, and the ILO is now recognizing that as a problem, they're trying to do pilots in countries, try and capture that. It's not yet rolled out across all the different country surveys so far, labor force surveys. If you do that, then you find even more concentration of women in the lower tier. In fact, when I looked at India, I found now 70% of lower tier are working by women, right? So that goes back to the question of how do we define women's work, how do we define lower tier work, if we include this broader definition. And I think the point is that why do we see in Indonesia and India, even without the broader definition? What I presented today was narrow definition of women's work, right? Or labor force participation. Even with the narrow definition, we seem to find that there are more women in lower tier jobs than upper tier informal or formal, except that formal rich employment segment where women have entered. Potentially, I told them Indonesia, potentially public sector jobs, maybe, potentially, I'm not sure. We haven't checked that. So maybe public sector jobs are better women participating. But except that one part of the formal upper tier, women are in lower tier jobs are mostly technical, right? In particular, unpaid family work is mostly women, right? Now, this is a big challenge for these two countries. You can't have a situation where approximately half the population, whatever the situation is, are in lower tier jobs, right? Now, somebody might say it's because of preferences, that's why they're there, but I don't think that cannot be the main reason. There is very significant segregation going on, labor markets in the lower tier, discrimination going on, and I think both countries need to address that because this is a big issue. Now, as you said, women are getting more educated, yes, but maybe there are barriers to entry to the higher paid jobs. Even in the informal market, labor market, there is upper tier jobs are difficult to get, right? So there is this question of what explains this concentration of women in the lower tier jobs, especially sector employment, and why that if you use even more expanded definition, which we should, is absolutely almost completely all women in the lower tier jobs. So this is a big question, I think, and I don't have an answer for Indonesia, but in India, we know there are significant social norms, segmentation, discrimination that operates in labor markets, where women are shut out from more productive jobs, right? Or better paid jobs. So that's my I think that's an important issue to think about. And I think there's a broader definition question here about how should we think about laboratory surveys when we have this work that's not been documented as standard surveys, including sacraments so far. Now, about the caste question, so again, so the paper doesn't talk about it so much, but in India, not only gender, but caste is very important. So if you're from a disadvantaged caste, almost surely, I would say 80% likelihood, you're in lower tier jobs. So the caste structure works like upper tier jobs, bottom jobs, higher caste, meaning there is a caste hierarchy, and if you're lower caste, then you are in lower tier jobs. And what are lower tier jobs in India? Lower tier jobs in cities are construction work, construction sites. You see a lot of workers who are wage workers. In rural areas in India, they are agricultural workers who are working in farms. So those kind of work is mostly done by the lower caste. So there's a caste issue, there's a gender issue, so these are big questions that you have to think about. What's going on in this country? And I think the question also about so social norms and the question about cultural factors, political economy issues, yeah, I mean, my paper doesn't really deal with those issues, but those are important issues to think about. Both these countries, and as came up in the discussion also, both these countries have seen pretty strong growth in the last, especially Indonesia, last 10 years, India now 20 odd years. And the growth has been in fairly in a situation where we have seen democracies, of course, but they're not perfect democracies in both countries. And I think the question is that, can this kind of growth last? How long can this last? And it links the question around manufacturing, services, AI, technology, globalization. These are big questions. And both the countries, exactly as Monica said, are really grappling with this. With demographic dividends slowly running out, population getting older, and not enough jobs around, better jobs. These are big challenges with both this big Asian economy, the two Asian giants, as they're calling my paper, are really having to deal with. And I don't have an answer to all of those issues, but I think it's a really big challenge. Both these countries are facing. I think Monica highlighted.
Thank you, Professor. Maybe from Ibu Monica Alpadewa, the additional response.
Okay, I'm also going to reverse the order of the question. So I'm going to answer first about the role of gender in inequality. So at least in Indonesia, there's you're right that actually tertiary education enrollment might be higher for women. But the problem in Indonesia is the transition from education to work. That's when women and men starts to diverge. And you can see why, because women, after their education, they start to enter their productive age, they get married, they have kids. So you can see the tension between work-life balance, especially in countries like Indonesia, where childcare might not be easily accessible. There are some jobs actually that could help women to go back to work after they take their maternity leave, for example, which is like e-commerce. So we've seen evidence that actually e-commerce is being used by women who have left the jobs market to re-enter the jobs market. And as Professor Sands already mentioned, there's gender segregation in terms of the sectors of employment. And it's a matter of also how actually women can cross this sectoral segmentation in the labor market. I mean, meaning that there are some sectors that are more dominated by males, and there are some sectors that are more dominated by females. But the question is, and those that are dominated by females are more likely to be lower paying sectors. So the question is how women can actually cross this sectoral segmentation. I mean, interestingly, in Indonesia, we find that when we take average wages between female and male workers in high-end services. Actually, female workers earn higher incomes in high-end services. So for female who are able to make it to the high-end services jobs, then they might actually be doing even better than their male counterparts. Now the questions on do we need like more GDP or do we just need to distribute the GDP better, right? There's like, of course, a lot of literatures already arguing how GDP is actually not a good economic indicator to begin with, right? I mean, it doesn't take into account environmental costs and other externalities. But I think what we want to see more in the future is the decoupling between economic growth and how we tackle climate change in terms of carbon emissions, right? So what we want to see is that higher economic growth doesn't mean that we emit more carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. That's what we want to see, the decoupling between carbon gas, greenhouse gas emissions and economic growth, right? In terms of the political economy of inequality, it's always been there since perhaps the histories of humanity. But I guess in the case of Indonesia and India, I think democratic backsliding might might pose, a threat to higher inequality just because institutions are endogenous. Those in power who will always be have like more interest to keep their wealth and to put in policies that will profit them. So I guess going forward, we just need more monitorings and transparencies in terms of how wealth is being distributed, and of course, continuously giving like opinions about economic policies going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. And Bu Mimi, the question is quite tough. So I think Bu Monica already highlighted some of them, but I just want to adding up a little bit, like the way we see in the naive way that economic growth will contribute to the employment creation and hopefully will reduce the inequality. I think that's the transmission or the channeling that we understand so far, at least conceptually or theoretically that we have. So then the question is any other approach to be able to achieve those kind of conditions. Then definitely, like Bu Monica already mentions, there are some externalities happening along the way in the process. So in my opinion, we cannot ignore the economic growth itself, right? That's still the indicators we have now. Of course, we are looking for better indicators, but along the way, we need to understand how actually this kind of economic growth will be able to redistribute the wealth, redistribute the income. So put it into partial way from the labor market approach, then we need to understand how the job creations after the economic growth happen, right? It's not only like, because even within the within the labor market itself, we already see some segregation, some inequality in terms of skills, in terms of access to job opportunities and so on. So again, we need to understand the transmission until we find out another indicators other than economic growth that might be able to explain further how we can reach this better equality in our economy. So, and the last one is about the gender and inequality. First of all, there is a social norms. Professor Sen already mentioned. Indonesia also have a strong social norms about it. Even though the education of female already increased quite a lot, but the participation, the employment female labor force participation is still stagnant. One of the explanations is social norms. If we see the demographic life cycles of female, when they transition from school to work, they will participate quite a lot by the time one of the demographic event, which is marriage, usually will hinder the opportunity of female to participate further in the labor market. The second demographic event is having children. So usually when you have a long gap in the labor markets, so you off from the labor market and then trying to get into the labor market again, they already lost some of the momentum. So that's why the participation even lower, or they will participate in the informal job. So now from our perspective as an economist, we already trying to measure or to monetize these activities of the households. That's why now we heard a lot about care economy. And in survey, we're trying to measure it. We have a time use survey. Our Indonesian office already trying to pilot this kind of activities, trying to measure our domestic work at home. Yeah. So we want to understand if our mother, if women work at home, taking care of their children, doing the household chores, what will be the valuations can be put into our GDP? As simple as that. Why we need to do that? Again, we need to measure it. We need to incorporate their activities. We don't want to ignore it in the economic activity. So that's why I guess for all of us here, if we are interested, it will be good arena, will be good topic to pursue further, to understand how this gender and inequality will be able to be solved very soon in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kunalsen, Ibu Monica, and Pak Dewa. Well, actually, we have more than 170 participants to Zoom, and I will give 4 persons in Zoom to deliver their question directly. We have Professor Hall Hill, Prof. Chris Manning, Bapak Abdul Haris, and Ibu Stania Puspawardani. So the first, I will give the opportunities to Professor Hall Hill to unmute your mic and deliver your questions.
Terima kasih banyak. Selamat siang dari Canberra. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Professor, it's very clear.
Okay, Kunal, it's great to see you. Only on the screen, but it's better than nothing. So thank you very much for the excellent presentation, and really enjoyed it. And hi also to Monica and Lydia and other friends. Kunal, as I say, excellent presentation. Just asking you to sort of stand back a little bit, thinking about your concept of the ladder and the segmentation in the labour market, both very important analytical tools. I wonder how you would address the question linked to it of, is the education system fundamentally egalitarian or not? That is, you know, looking at educational outcomes, not just quantity, but importantly quality, correlated by socioeconomic class. And my guess is that it's not particularly egalitarian in either country, and that sort of feeds into the fact that your notion of people being trapped at the lower ends and the informal, insecure employment. I see that Raghuram Rajam has a book on this recently, which emphasizes the India story. And of course, there is a big literature for Indonesia on it. That's my main question. And if I may just have a footnote, if I may, Kunal, in a recent issue of The Economist, there was a statement that, and it links to your gender issue too, there was a statement that there are more women employed in the Bangladesh garment industry than women employed in the entire formal sector Indian manufacturing industry, that is all sectors. Is that actually correct? It seems to me it's almost an unbelievable figure, but if it's correct, the implications are quite staggering. So thank you very much, and wonderful show. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Hall Hill, and maybe for Pak Chris Manning. Okay.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's clear.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with Hal Hill. That was a great presentation and a great discussion. We've rarely have serious discussions about India and Indonesia. We have lots of discussions about Indonesia in East Asia, but this is really interesting, and there are many interesting areas that policy for policy options. One thing I got out of your presentation, Kunal, is really how segmented the Indian labour market is in comparison to Indonesia, which is not often something that's highlighted in discussions about Indonesia when it's compared with other East Asian countries. So the inequality, the lower rates of formal employment, the bigger differences between lower and upper tier workers in terms of wages, all of those are quite striking. There's one dimension of it that I wanted to ask about, and that is the labour market institutions and policies. Indonesia is a newcomer in those areas because during the Suharto period, labour institutions were, labour was very tightly controlled, to put it very broadly. But now it's beginning to bring in some much more active labour market policies. My understanding is labour market policies, particularly the minimum wages, have been quite fundamental in Indian social policy. And I wonder if you could offer any suggestions as to what directions Indonesia might go in that area. It's not directly related to the tiers, although it is partly because the bottom end, I think, of the formal labour market is not very well protected at all in India, but the upper end of it is heavily protected. So my question is, do you have any suggestions for Indonesian social policy related to labour that Indonesia can learn from maybe the mistakes in India? Thanks very much. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Manning, and then to Pak Abdul Haris.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Prof. Kunal, for sharing a very important paper. Actually, my question already raised by others. So I'm curious about factors that may drive the result of your study, as you explained in your presentation. Could be government policy, such as minimum wage in unemployment or local content requirement in industry, or policies in other related sector, and also the potential influence of major natural disaster. As you may know that during your study period, Indonesia experienced several major disasters, tsunami in Aceh, just take it as example. So I'm wondering whether you incorporate these factors in your study, and could you explain further about this aspect? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Abdul. And then the last from Ibu Stania.
Yes, thank you. My name is Tanya from Center of Reform on Economics, or CORE Indonesia. One thing from your presentation, Professor Kunal, is that Indonesia's manufacturing industry is growing faster than India, and many people think that manufacturing industry, which creates large job creations, is the only way to achieve as an advanced nation or as a developed country. But some says that there are. Okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay, but there are some. Sorry. But there are some strategy that says that service sectors is probably one of the strategy to reach into advanced nation. So I'm wondering whether, as you mentioned, that service sector in India contribute largely over 50% to GDP and 54% to gross value added, while in Indonesia, service sectors contribute only for 41.79%. Is there going to be a difference in economic trajectory and the future policy approach regarding these service sectors to reach into the status of advanced nation, both in Indonesia and India? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Guru Sanya and Professor. Please give your response to the question. No?
Okay, thanks. I mean, wonderful to have Hal Hill and Chris Manning online and to listen to my lecture. Hal, you know, I don't have to tell you how much I've learned so much from your work. Actually, I was telling somebody today that I went back to your book again, your amazing book, and again, just marveled at how much knowledge we get from reading your book. So I just wanted to say that. I think, you know, the point about the question around educational outcomes, quality adjusted, because I think if we don't adjust for quality, it will be very misleading in both these countries. Quality of education does differ quite a bit. I agree with you. If you did imagine you had a sort of a counterfactual that equalized educational outcomes across groups and across populations in terms of quality, maybe then the job ladder would look very different. I can't really do that because it's difficult to do that counterfactual in this case. But if we did that, yes, I do think there would be a difference because clearly those who are the most educated are in the top tier and their children would almost surely be also well educated and also be the top tier and so on. So this generational inequality will carry on in the job ladder. Similarly, those who are in the lower tier are not so well educated and their children will not so be well educated because of lack of access to good education, and that will carry on. So there is this very strong correlation or cumulative causation going on between educational outcomes, quality adjusted educational outcomes, and the job ladder, how it evolves over time. And it might be really important to kind of examine that more systematically than I have done in this presentation or paper. There's something worth thinking about and thinking about more structural models that can try and capture that. So that's the first one. The second point about the question about women in garments in Bangladesh is an important point because a lot of these women who came to work in garment factories in Bangladesh, and there's been very good work on this by Mushfiq Mubarak, an economist based in Yale, that a lot of these women are actually first generation learners in the family, first actually also to enter the labor market. They moved to the labor market even before their brothers in families where essentially that movement hadn't happened. And so that phenomena of women being employed in garments, which is by and large formal wage employment, most of these are formal wage workers, is something that perhaps Indonesia and India have not seen as much. And so therefore, there is an interesting comparison with Bangladesh in gender and job ladder versus India, where we haven't seen that, not as much women in formal manufacturing, and also perhaps also Indonesia. That's a very interesting question, how that happened in Bangladesh as compared to these other Asian economies. Now, on terms of the previous questions around labor market institutions. Now, I see labor market institutions, and maybe I should have, because this question also came to discuss this, I see them in two clusters. One is around the question of firing workers and hiring workers. So India has extremely stringent employment protection legislation. It's very difficult to fire a formal worker, almost impossible really. So India has very strict legislation all the way from 1947. There is something called the Industrial Disputes Act, which has really made it very difficult for formal companies to fire workers. And that law, that particular legislation hasn't really changed. More at the margin, there's been some changes at the state levels, but not nationally. Now, I do think, now what happens then? What happens is formal companies don't want to hire a permanent worker. Because they hire a permanent worker, somebody that gets permanent status, They can't fire that person. What they do is employ them informally, called contract workers. They call them contract workers in India. And they hire them informally by not giving them social security and so on, and so that if they need to fire them, it's easy. I do think that's why, and I should have commented on that in the paper, I do think that is the reason why in India, we noticed the upper tier informal wage employment has increased in size, but the formal wage employment is kind of stuck, more or less. I think that's what's happening in India. In Indonesia, we didn't see that, right? So maybe in India, part of the problem is this formal, the legislation that we have on employment protection, as compared to Indonesia, where we haven't had as much, I think might explain why in India, formal wage employment is kind of stuck, around 15% or so, and upper tier informal wage employment, which includes these workers who are contract workers, are informally employed, is increasing in size. Now that's one, but the minimum wage is a different story. I do think that in minimum wages, I'm not completely convinced by the argument that if you bring in minimum wages, even with good enforcement, that has a negative effect on lower tier employment or wages. I do think in India, we've seen minimum wages increasing. In India, minimum wage is a state level jurisdiction. I think in Indonesia also, the province level, right? So in India, the states can increase minimum wages, and they have. And they have increased minimum wages. And I think in India, certainly that has led, even with imperfect enforcement, wages of the lower paid workers increasing without any significant employment effects. Why? Because those workers, really speaking, the minimum wages increase, there is no incentive for firms to essentially fire those workers. So we haven't seen the negative employment effects you might see for higher end workers, and we've seen wages increase. So minimum wages, I think, is a different story there. I do think that maybe in Indonesia, perhaps that's something to be, perhaps that one can think about. I'm, again, not an expert on minimum wages in Indonesia, but the Indian story on labor market protection of formal workers is not something one should regulate. Because in India, that has not, and that's evident from my presentation, has not led to more formal sector wage employment. If anything, it's led to this upper informal wage employment increasing in size. So I think that's an important point to be made on labor markets. So Abdul Haris asked a question, Aceh, and one of the things that came up in the discussants' comments, it's easy now that we've done this coding, thanks to these two very good listeners. One of them I can see now sitting in the room here. You can do this province by province in Indonesia. You can do this state by state in India. And then there's a really interesting question. What happens in a particular province? Some big shock happens. Does the job ladder shift? How does it change compared to some other province where something similar has not happened? And that leads to COVID-19 shocks too, actually. So I hope that what we have tried to do in this paper, assuming that you believe that the methodology is more or less okay, which is always an open question for any economist, you could then try to replicate this province by province in Indonesia, state by state in India, and then look at state level policies and see whether or not you're seeing changes in job ladders over time, and whether state level shocks, policies have an effect, or province level shocks, have an effect in Indonesia. That could be a really interesting project. And hopefully what I've tried to do in this paper can start the process of looking at this issue regionally. Job ladders differ by province, and clearly they will differ over time with shocks and so on that look at the next. All right, so I think that's a very important way to push this work forward. Because I do think one reason I wrote this paper, I have to say, I want to make a methodological point that one can do this using Saccharine surveys with all its problems that we already mentioned, that one can try to take this work forward, because it's a very important way to think about the way we look at particularly informal work. Informal work needs to be distinguished between different kinds of informal work. So hopefully this is a way one of the reasons I wrote this paper was to try and push labor economy to think more about this in Indonesia and also in India. So that's an important point there. So the last question was, so I would say, again, so I was just thinking about this. It's so easy if I wanted to do this, not maybe in this paper that I have to be years because I've already I've reached my limit of the word count. In the future, one can reclassify this tiers by sectors and occupations, and by, as you mentioned, there was about private sector versus government employees, right? All that's possible. So I think that'd be a fascinating question to look at. Where do we see opportunity jobs, all the foreign jobs? Which service sector, which service sector? The service sector is very, very big. You need to think about service sector being different kinds of services. So this allows us to disaggregate into sectors, occupations, private, government employment, and so on. So that's the other thing. I think that once the coding is possible, I'll be happy to share the coding strategy for anyone interested. It's not that complicated, I think, though it's a lot of work actually on the part of two very able research assistants who did this work with me. But it's something we can take forward. So sector analysis, occupation analysis, all of this is possible. We're doing this right now for Africa because we have been asked to do that. I haven't done it for Indonesia as yet, and maybe it's the next thing I should do.
Thank you, Professor. Maybe Ibu Monica or Pak Dewa have additional lessons. Yes, around 2 minutes.
Just a very small comments, just adding to Professor Sen's response to Professor Halhill about the wage employment in Bangladesh vis-a-vis wage employment in the Indian manufacturing sector. I think that's what I pointed out in my presentation, that maybe countries like Indonesia and India need to focus more on the labor-intensive part of the manufacturing sector, like textile, garment, apparel, footwear, right? Instead of just, let's say, like automobile and semiconductor. So that's one point. And then the second point about the services sector, I just would like to point out that in a lot of economic policies and industrial policies, there are this disconnect between the demand to create jobs and then the industrial economic policies in these countries. So that needs to be better linked, in my view. Like Indonesia and India has a labor surplus that we need to facilitate to get good jobs. But sometimes the industrial economic policies are a bit like disconnect from this reality. And services is an important sector for the manufacturing, so we cannot not pay attention to the services sector, but a lot of times is underplayed, partly because it's more difficult to collect data on the services sector than the manufacturing sector. I mean, in the case of Indonesia, there's no there's no firm level services data, unlike the manufacturing. So we do have firm level manufacturing data, but not services data. So that's one of the difficulties in terms of collecting services data.
Thank you, Ibu Monica, and so time is up, and thank you very much for Prof. Kunal-sen and Ibu Monica and Pak Dewa. So please give warm applause to the presenter and also discussions. Now I will return the event to Devina as the MC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bu Hanu. Okay, thank you to all speakers, discussants, and the chair for sharing their insightful findings and engaging in very interesting discussions on this issue of labor market. Let's give once again a round of applause to Professor Kunal-sen, Ibu Maria Monica Wiharja, Bapak Idewa Gedeo Karma Wisana, and Ibu Hairina Hanum Siregar. Okay. As we conclude today's lecture, we extend our deepest gratitude to all speakers, discussants, and participants for your active engagement and invaluable contributions to the discussion. We'd like to offer our sincere appreciation once again to Bank Mandiri for supporting this event. We also offer our sincere apologies for any mistakes or inconvenience experienced during the proceeding. Additionally, we will distribute e-certificates to in-person participants next week along with lecture materials via email. We kindly request your participation in filling out the evaluation form for our internal assessment. Now we invite all speakers, discussants, and the participants to enjoy lunch, which has been prepared outside this room. We look forward to welcoming you to our next event. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.